It started with an outrageous act of disrespect that no one saw coming. My son's military uniform, the symbol of his sacrifice and service, was burned by the HOA president. But what she didn't know was that the U.S. Marines were now locking in on her, and they don't take betrayal lightly. It all began with the kind of petty nuisance that's become all too familiar in HOA communities, a handful of complaints from a neighbor who believed their small role in the community gave them absolute power. Our family had always been quiet, respectful tenants in the neighborhood. We followed the rules, paid our dues, and maintained our property to the standards expected by the Homeowners Association (HOA). To be honest, we rarely even interacted with the HOA president, Susan, beyond the standard meetings and email updates. Susan had been the HOA president for several years, and from the start, she had a reputation for being micromanaging and somewhat overly zealous about enforcing the rules. Little things would set her off: a slightly overgrown hedge, a neighbor parking in front of their own house for a bit longer than allowed, or a garden decoration that didn't meet her personal taste. It wasn't that her demands were unreasonable, but they seemed more like an opportunity for Susan to assert control over others than to ensure the neighborhood was truly being kept up to its best standard. But despite her seemingly trivial complaints, things had always been manageable. We had learned how to navigate Susan's demands with diplomacy, always staying on her good side, always following the rules, and in return, we were left in peace. It was a strange, fragile balance that kept things relatively smooth. Then, it all started to unravel when Susan began to take a personal interest in our family. We first noticed the subtle changes when my son returned home from his latest tour of duty. He had been deployed for months, facing the kind of intense combat situations that most people couldn't even fathom. He returned home in one piece, but those months away had undoubtedly left their mark. The military has a way of changing people, shaping them into something stronger, something tougher. But there's also a weight that comes with it. It's the weight of the things you've seen and the things you've had to do in service to your country. My son came home, not with grand stories of heroism, but with a quiet pride in his service and the understanding that what he had done mattered. He had brought his military uniform home, his dress uniform, carefully folded and packed away to preserve the hard-earned medals and patches that told the story of his service. It wasn't just a uniform, it was a part of him, a symbol of everything he had endured, everything he had sacrificed. It had seen the worst of the worst, and it had been there with him through every moment of it. Susan, however, didn't see it that way. To her, my son's uniform wasn't a symbol of honor. It was just another thing in the neighborhood to control. She'd always been the type to act like the HOA was her domain, and she would wield it like a sword to maintain her idea of order. The first warning signs were the odd, small complaints about things she thought were out of place: a small flagpole in the front yard, the outdoor light bulb that had been left on for a few hours too long, the Christmas wreath on the front door that she deemed too gaudy. At first, we thought it was just more of the usual, but then something fell off. We didn't realize just how far Susan's animosity toward us had developed. She began to target us specifically, her complaints growing increasingly personal, almost vindictive. My wife and I initially tried to brush it off. We chalked it up to a misunderstanding, or maybe Susan just needed something to do with her spare time. But then came that one call, the one that changed everything. I'll never forget that frantic phone call from my wife. She was in a state of shock, her voice trembling as she explained that something had happened to my son's uniform. The military uniform, the one he had brought home with pride, had gone missing. At first, we thought maybe he had taken it to the dry cleaners or that it had gotten misplaced somewhere. But when my wife ventured into the backyard, her worst fears were realized. There, scattered across the grass, were the remnants of my son's uniform reduced to ashes. Susan, in a move that can only be described as malicious, had burned my son's military uniform. The patches, the medals, the fabric, it all went up in flames. She thought it was a harmless act, a small way to strike back at us for reasons no one fully understood. After all, she was the HOA president. She assumed she could do whatever she wanted. She believed No one would challenge her actions. No one would dare question the power she wielded as president. But what she failed to realize was just how wrong she was. This wasn't just about a piece of fabric. It wasn't just about a uniform that had been worn by my son. It was about disrespecting everything he had gone through, everything he had given to serve his country. And it wasn't just my son who would feel this disrespect. It was a slap in the face to every single member of the military community. What Susan failed to understand was that her actions would not go unnoticed. She had made a grave mistake, one that would set in motion a chain of events she could never have predicted. What she thought was an inconsequential act of defiance against a family she had a personal vendetta against was, in fact, the beginning of her downfall. As we stood there, staring at the ashes of my son's uniform, the reality of what Susan had done began to sink in. The shock was overwhelming. How could someone do this? How could someone so blatantly disrespect not just my son, but the entire military community? It wasn't just a personal attack. It was an attack on the values that my son had fought for, an attack on the very principles that this country was built on. But what Susan didn't know was that her actions had consequences far beyond the scope of the HOA. This was just the beginning of the storm she had unleashed. When my son found out what had happened to his military uniform, the emotional impact was immediate and overwhelming. It wasn't just the physical loss of an item, it was the sheer disrespect that accompanied it. The uniform wasn't merely a piece of clothing. It was a testament to his sacrifice, his hard work, and the life-altering experiences he had endured in service to his country. To have it burned, destroyed by someone who held no regard for the meaning behind it, felt like an affront not only to him, but to every service member who had ever worn the uniform. The anger in his eyes was something I will never forget. It wasn't the typical response to something trivial. This was the kind of rage that came from the heart of someone who had faced combat, who had walked through hell, and who had come back changed. The pain was there, too, hidden beneath the surface of the fury. Pain from having given so much only to have someone trivialize everything he stood for. And that pain, once visible, quickly turned to a deep sense of betrayal. The person responsible for this was someone who should have known better, someone in a position of authority, a leader in the community. My son's fury wasn't just about the loss of his uniform. It was about the deeper insult, the audacity of an HOA president, a person who was supposed to serve the community, to destroy something so sacred. The destruction of the uniform represented a much greater violation, an attack on his identity, his integrity, and everything he had fought for. There was no way we could simply let it go. The more I saw the hurt in my son's eyes, the more my resolve hardened. This wasn't just a personal issue anymore. It was a matter of principle. My initial attempt to handle the situation was to reach out to Susan directly, hoping that some form of communication might resolve the issue. I didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily. I wanted an explanation, an apology, something that could restore a sense of decency to the situation. Maybe Susan had acted out of ignorance or some misguided sense of humor, I thought. Surely, she didn't understand the weight of what she had done. I gave her the benefit of the doubt, assuming she might have been unaware of the emotional and cultural significance of my son's uniform. I was wrong. Susan's response, or lack thereof, only deepened the wound. When I contacted her, hoping for a conversation, or at the very least some form of accountability, I was met with indifference. She didn't express remorse, nor did she seem to grasp the gravity of her actions. Instead, she laughed it off, dismissing the uniform as just a piece of clothing. To her, it wasn't a symbol of sacrifice, valor, or pride, it was just fabric. And she made it clear that it wasn't something she thought should have any significance. She claimed that it wasn't a big deal, that I was overreacting. Her tone dripped with arrogance, a sense of superiority that made it clear she didn't care about the hurt she had caused. She was too wrapped up in her power trip to even understand the weight of what she had done. This nonchalant dismissal only made things worse. It turned a personal attack into a community-wide issue. Susan didn't just hurt my son, she insulted everyone who had ever served, everyone who understood the value of honor, duty, and sacrifice. To her, the uniform was something to be discarded, something easily replaceable. But that wasn't the case. The uniform represented everything my son had worked for, fought for, and risked his life for. To Susan, it was just no big deal, but to us, it was a direct slap in the face. Her actions forced us into a corner. There was no way we could just ignore this. We couldn't pretend it was a simple misunderstanding. This wasn't a small issue to be swept under the rug. It was an act of deep disrespect, and it required a response. If we let her get away with this, what kind of message would it send? What kind of example would it set for others who might think they could disrespect the service and sacrifices of military families without consequence? It became clear to me that this was no longer just about my son's uniform. It was about a principle we couldn't afford to compromise on. We were dealing with someone who had no respect for what my son had gone through, someone who thought they could get away with such a blatant violation of honor and dignity. And if we let her off the hook, we would be letting her destroy the integrity of what my son and others like him had fought for. This situation had escalated far beyond the destruction of a piece of fabric. It had become a matter of upholding the values that define us as a community, as a country, and as individuals who respect the sacrifices of those who serve. My son had put his life on the line, and Susan had trampled on that commitment. Her dismissive attitude, her lack of accountability, her refusal to understand the gravity of what she had done, made it clear that she wasn't the kind of person who deserved the position of power she held. Her actions had consequences, and we couldn't let those consequences be ignored. This wasn't just about getting an apology, it was about making sure that no one else could ever do something like this and get away with it. At this point, we knew we had no choice but to take action. The next steps wouldn't be easy, but they were necessary. We couldn't let Susan's arrogance define this situation. We had to find a way to make her understand the depth of her actions and ensure she faced the consequences of them. My son's uniform may have been destroyed, but the integrity, honor, and respect it represented would not be. When my son's military uniform was destroyed, the emotional wounds ran deep, not just for him, but for our entire family. At first, we tried to handle things quietly, believing Susan's actions were an isolated incident of ignorance. However, it became apparent that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was an attack on everything my son and countless others in the military stood for. Susan's indifference to the severity of her actions made it clear that this wasn't something we could simply resolve with a conversation or a polite letter of complaint. This required more. What made the situation even more infuriating was the arrogance with which Susan dismissed any attempt at resolution. Her lack of remorse, her belief that she could dismiss the significance of a military uniform, highlighted just how out of touch she was with the very principles that shaped my son's life and the lives of countless service members. It wasn't just about the destruction of a uniform, it was about disrespected sacrifice, disrespected honor, and disrespected duty. This wasn't a personal grievance anymore. This was a violation of the code that binds the military community together. It was then that we realized we needed support. This wasn't a battle we could win on our own. We had to make sure that Susan understood the gravity of what she had done, and we knew that confronting her on our own wouldn't make the kind of impact needed. My son, despite his intense anger, knew that his actions alone would not be enough to make Susan comprehend the magnitude of her offense. He had always been taught that honor, loyalty, and respect were core tenets of his identity. But Susan had shown no respect for those same values. And now, the situation had escalated far beyond something we could just manage ourselves. That's when the idea struck. We weren't just going standby. We would bring in those who knew exactly how much a uniform meant, how much every soldier's service meant. We turned to the U.S. Marines. The Marine Corps is not just a branch of the military, it's a brotherhood. Once a Marine, always a Marine. The bond among those who have served is unbreakable. It didn't matter whether my son was on active duty or back in the civilian world, the Marines had his back. I began reaching out to Marines who had served with him, veterans who had been through their own trials and sacrifices, and active duty Marines who understood what it meant to disrespect someone who wore that uniform. The response was swift and overwhelming. It didn't take long before we realized that Susan had underestimated the reach of her actions. The Marines don't forget, and they don't forgive disrespect. We weren't the only ones who saw this as a problem. It was a problem for the entire military community. Word spread quickly, and it wasn't long before the story of Susan's actions reached military circles far beyond our small neighborhood. Veterans rallied behind my son, and the weight of their support wasn't something Susan could easily dismiss. The Marines, a group bound by loyalty and respect, weren't about to let someone tarnish their image, especially not over something as ridiculous as a petty vendetta. Susan's attempt to destroy something so sacred, so deeply significant to the military community, wasn't going to go unnoticed. The Marines weren't just some distant bystanders, they were a force that stood in solidarity with us. Their reach went far beyond any HOA regulations. It was no longer about my son's uniform, it was about standing up for the honor and the integrity of the entire military community. As the word spread, things began to change rapidly. Susan, who had once held all the power as HOA president, suddenly found herself on the receiving end of a much more formidable force than she could have ever anticipated. The Marine Corps doesn't just show up in physical terms, they bring their full support, their community, and their influence. Veterans reached out, both on the phone and through social media, expressing their outrage. Others called for action, demanding that Susan be held accountable for her actions. We were now part of something bigger. The power of the U.S. Marines was not just about military strength, it was about a code of conduct that transcended rank and authority. The Marines believe in standing up for what's right, regardless of the situation. Susan's small act of rebellion against one uniform had become a violation of a much larger honor. And as soon as the Marines took notice, Susan's position in the community became untenable. Her days of feeling untouchable, of thinking she could abuse her position and make decisions without consequences, were numbered. The community, already disgusted by her actions, now had the full weight of the military behind it. The Marines weren't interested in playing games with someone who showed such blatant disrespect. The HOA bylaws, which Susan had used to bully neighbors, suddenly seemed trivial in comparison to the respect that military service commands. The more the Marines got involved, the more it became clear that Susan's life was about to take a drastic turn. Her personal vendetta, fueled by nothing more than her desire for control, now faced the judgment of a community that could no longer ignore her disrespect. The Marines weren't just watching, they were actively involved. This wasn't about a single military uniform anymore. It was about the message it sent to the entire military community that no one, not even the president of an HOA, could get away with disrespecting those who served. Susan had underestimated the Marines' loyalty and their commitment to supporting their own. What she had seen as a petty, harmless act had turned into a fight for something much larger. Her attempts to intimidate and bully my family had backfired. With the U.S. Marines now focused on her actions, the consequences were about to come crashing down on her. The military Brotherhood had its eyes on Susan, and they wouldn't look away until justice was served. As the pressure mounted, Susan's initial attempts to brush off the situation quickly lost their effectiveness. She had underestimated the power of the military community and the unshakable bond shared by those who had served. When the Marines became involved, she tried to downplay the seriousness of the situation, claiming that their response was nothing more than an overreaction. In her eyes, their anger was misplaced, an exaggerated response to something she believed wasn't worth the attention it was getting. To her, it was a simple misunderstanding, an isolated incident that shouldn't be given more significance than it deserved. At first, Susan seemed convinced that she could ride out the storm. She had long been in a position of power, surrounded by people who had respected her authority and decisions. Her confidence in her position led her to dismiss any dissenting voices, including the veterans and active duty military personnel who were now rallying against her. She ridiculed the idea of veterans organizing and showing their support for my son, laughing off the notion that it could lead to any real consequences. After all, she had been the HOA president for years, used to pushing people around and using her influence to get her way. Surely, she thought this would blow over just like every other conflict she'd faced. But as word of the incident spread, something unexpected happened. The community that once viewed her as an unchallenged authority figure began to splinter. Her power, which had always been built on intimidation and control, began to erode. As more people learned about her actions, many began to question their loyalty to her. Even the residents who had once supported her without question started to second-guess their allegiance. They saw the outrage from veterans, military families, and neighbors who had been affected by her behavior. What had been a small community issue over an HOA rule now morphed into a matter of integrity, honor, and respect for those who had served. People who had remained silent when it came to her authoritarian approach to community management now found their voices. They recognized that Susan's behavior went beyond the realm of HOA politics. This wasn't just a dispute over a rule or a fine. This was about the values that defined their country and their lives. The more Susan downplayed the severity of the situation, the more the community rallied against her. It became clear that her attempt to trivialize the incident wasn't going to work. What she had seen as a harmless prank or minor mistake was now viewed by many as an act of blatant disrespect. Despite the growing backlash, Susan's defense remained feeble. She clung to her assertion that it was all just a misunderstanding. She repeatedly claimed that my son was exaggerating the importance of the uniform, accusing him of being too sensitive about something as trivial as a piece of clothing. But this wasn't just about the fabric. Susan failed to grasp the broader context. This wasn't just a personal grievance. It was an attack on the very principles of honor, duty, and sacrifice. For anyone who had served in the military, for anyone who understood what it meant to wear that uniform, it was far more than just an item of clothing. It represented years of dedication, training, and a willingness to give everything for the safety and security of the country. Her refusal to understand that only deepened the divide between her and the rest of the community. The more she tried to minimize the situation, the more she alienated the people around her. Her words seemed to fall flat with those who knew better. It was one thing to downplay a petty argument, but this was different. She had attacked something sacred, something that held deep emotional and cultural significance for so many people. And yet, she continued to act as though it was all just a misunderstanding. The veterans, the military families, and the members of the community who had been affected by her actions weren't fooled. In many ways, Susan's defense reflected her lack of empathy and her failure to understand the values she was supposed to uphold as a leader. Her actions, and the way she tried to brush them off, revealed a character flaw that was impossible to ignore. She didn't seem to care about the feelings of others, nor did she show any remorse for what she had done. Instead, she blamed my son for overreacting, essentially shifting the responsibility for her actions onto him. This not only demonstrated her lack of accountability, but it also revealed her inability to acknowledge the depth of the damage she had caused. What she didn't realize was that her attempt to minimize the situation was not only damaging her reputation within the HOA, but it was also making her an enemy to the very community she had once tried to control. The more she attempted to deflect blame and ridicule those who were outraged, the more her actions painted her as someone who didn't care about the community's values. And it was becoming more and more evident that her behavior had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Susan had started this conflict with the belief that she could easily manipulate and intimidate those around her. But now, she was facing a backlash that was beyond her control. Her position was weakening by the day. The more she tried to dismiss the situation, the stronger the opposition grew. The community's outrage wasn't something she could just brush aside. It was a force that was gaining momentum, and soon she would have no choice but to face the consequences of her actions. Her efforts to defend herself weren't just ineffective, they were making things worse. Each attempt to minimize the situation only highlighted her failure to grasp the magnitude of what she had done. And as the pressure continued to build, it became clear that Susan's time as HOA president was running out. As the days wore on, the consequences of Susan's actions became undeniable. The Marines weren't simply reacting with anger, they were mobilizing, organizing, and bringing to bear every bit of their influence to ensure that Susan would face the consequences of her actions. The incident with the uniform, which Susan had so arrogantly dismissed, had triggered a ripple effect that no one, least of all Susan, could have predicted. This was no longer just a personal vendetta, it was a battle for respect, integrity, and honor, and the Marines were not going to let it slide. From the moment they became involved, the Marines demonstrated just how tightly knit their network was. Veterans and active duty personnel, many of whom had served alongside my son or had connections to him through the military community, began to rally together. Some reached out to local news outlets, making sure that Susan's actions and her callous disregard for military honor would not be swept under the rug. Others took a more direct approach, contacting local politicians and using their influence to make sure that Susan's position was no longer secure. The Marines' message was loud and clear. Disrespecting a uniform was not just disrespecting one person, it was disrespecting an entire community of people who had put their lives on the line for their country. And that message echoed through every corner of the military community, gaining momentum with every passing day. Susan, for all her attempts to downplay the situation, couldn't ignore the flood of support for my son and the Marines who stood behind him. The investigation into her behavior wasn't limited to her destruction of the uniform. It quickly became clear that Susan had a long history of overstepping her boundaries as HOA president. Complaints surfaced from other residents who had experienced her high-handedness and lack of respect for the rules. It seemed that her disregard for others wasn't confined to my family. She had built a reputation as someone who wielded her power recklessly, bullying and intimidating anyone who dared to challenge her. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Susan's actions were not just a one-time lapse in judgment. They were part of a larger pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. And as the Marines began to shine a spotlight on her past actions, it was impossible for the HOA board or the local community to ignore the growing pressure. They could no longer defend her or look the other way. The uproar from the military community, combined with the increasing number of residents who came forward with their grievances, created an overwhelming tide of support for Susan's removal. Susan, however, didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation until it was too late. She continued to downplay the issue, attempting to minimize the significance of her actions and belittle those who stood up against her. She believed that by maintaining her defiant stance, she could weather the storm and ride out the backlash. But this was no ordinary conflict. This was about much more than a local dispute. It was about standing up for what was right, for the values of honor and respect that the Marines held dear. As the pressure continued to build, Susan found herself increasingly isolated. Her usual allies within the community began to turn their backs on her. The HOA board members, who had once supported her without question, were now quietly distancing themselves. The media coverage, once sympathetic to her position as HOA president, began to shift as well. The story of her disrespect toward a military uniform, coupled with the growing outrage from the military community, started to dominate local news cycles. And with each passing day, Susan's credibility and authority continued to erode. The final blow came when the HOA board, faced with mounting public pressure and the undeniable influence of the Marines, voted to remove Susan from her position as president. Her fall from power was swift and decisive. The position she had once used to control and intimidate others was stripped from her with a single vote, and she was effectively removed from any further involvement in the HOA's operations. The board, perhaps realizing the gravity of the situation, made it clear that Susan's actions had not only hurt my family, but had damaged the HOA's reputation as well. Her removal was seen as a necessary step to restore the community's faith in the leadership and to send a message that such behavior would not be tolerated. Susan, in the end, had no one to blame but herself. Her refusal to take responsibility for her actions, her stubbornness in the face of mounting evidence, and her utter disregard for the values she was supposed to uphold as HOA president had cost her everything. What she had once seen as a minor offense, a harmless prank, had snowballed into a full-blown scandal. And as the Marines watched from the sidelines, they knew that justice had been served. Her life was forever altered. The community, once under her control, was now freed from the grip of her arrogance and misconduct. The Marines had sent a clear message: you never disrespect a Marine, and you certainly never mess with what they stand for. The cost of Susan's actions was more than just the loss of her position. It was the destruction of her reputation and the complete unraveling of her power. What began as an attempt to undermine my son's service had ultimately led to the collapse of her own authority. For my son, it was a bittersweet victory. While his uniform could never be fully replaced, the justice that came from the collective efforts of the military community was a testament to the honor and respect that the Marines, along with countless other veterans, held for those who served. Susan had learned the hard way that you can never underestimate the power of a united military community, and that no one, no matter how powerful they think they are, can ever stand above the values that our service members uphold. If you want to hear more shocking stories like this, make sure to subscribe to expect stories and never miss out on the drama.